The optimism over a growth revival has received a double jolt. Inflation remains stubborn and growth is barely crawling. Retail inflation in August slowed only marginally to 7.8% against 7.96% in July. Vegetable prices are the main culprit once again. Vegetable inflation has remained high at 15.5% in August against 16.8% in July. As a result, food prices remain elevated at 9.16. But thanks to the government offloading food grains, cereal inflation remains steady at 7.39% in August. And all is not lost. Core inflation has eased considerably, even dropping below 7% compared to 7.4% in July. But what about growth? India's factories are still not out of the woods. Industrial production in July slowed to its lowest level in 4 months, barely clocking any growth, coming at a mere 0.5%. Manufacturing growth contracted by 1%, and capital goods growth shrunk nearly 4%. The fall in core inflation is a sign of weakening demand, and that is reflected in the 21% contraction suffered by consumer durables. All in all, the room for the central bank to ease rates to spur growth looks almost negligible in the near future, as inflation fight is far from over. Right. So that's the number that's thrown up by the Friday data, that inflation is still elevated at 7.8%. What I'm asking today is whether even at 7.8%, the inflation battle is largely won. Joining me to discuss that is Dr. Pranob, Chairman of the National Statistical Commission and quite clearly the best statistician in India, Chetan, Ahya, Managing Director and Chief Economist, Asia Pacific at Morgan Stanley, and Prasanna, Chief Economist at ICICI Securities Primary Dealership Unit. Gentlemen, welcome and good morning to all of you. Well, I'm presenting some data which is running even as I speak with you. I want to point out that vegetable inflation in July this year and July last year were equally at 16.8% or 16.5%. But if we look at the trajectory of vegetable inflation, this year from 16 it has fallen to 15.5 in August, and last year it actually went up to 26% in August, and then 35, 45, 61 and 38 in the remaining 6 months of the year, basically shooting up. This despite a fairly good monsoon last year. Likewise, let me compare cereal inflation. Cereal inflation was a mighty 16.3% in last July. This July, it's already just 7.5%. August as well, it has fallen actually to 7.3%. But last August, cereal inflation shot up to 14% and then remained elevated at 12% from September, October, November and December 2013. So cereal inflation was not controlled despite a very good Kharif last year. As a result, food inflation, which started off at 11.2% in July last year, peaked at 14.7% in November before receding somewhat to 12% in December. Fortunately, this time, even in July, we are at 9% and in August, we remain at 9%. Now, Dr. Sen, with this data, are you getting a sense that food inflation is a far smaller problem this year?
Well, you can't quite say that yet. I mean, I think what last year's data is showing is the damage that a high MSP can do, because it not only pushes up cereal inflation, but much worse, it actually diverts land away from non-cereal food crops to cereals, which is what causes the pressure on vegetables. This year, the monsoon has been worse, but the monsoon hasn't been as bad. It's been delayed, and it's made up a lot of ground towards the latter part of the season. So what we have, and we also have a situation where the MSP has not been increased very dramatically. So what we can hope for, and one can't say that one really expects it as yet because the data isn't in, but what one can hope for is that the late sowing will have a depressive effect on cereal production. So we're not going to have a lot of land going under cereals, and hopefully some of that land will go into vegetable production and will ease the problems at the vegetable front. So we're not going to hopefully see the kind of accelerating inflation we saw in vegetables last year.
Okay. But Dr. Sen, do you think that cereal inflation may not remain at just 7%? Do you fear that it can still rise as we get the delayed effects of a lower output compared to last year?
Not necessarily. You know, the government has made a very clear statement that they're willing to offload up to 15 million tons of food grains. If they actually keep to that promise, cereal inflation can actually be brought down to sub 6%.
Okay. Well, Prasanna, on the same data for you, you have been speaking to a lot of economists and policymakers in Delhi as well. What is the sense you're getting? Has the government been more active in offloading grains so that despite a poor monsoon, there has not been a huge effect of vegetable prices on cereal inflation? Do you think they are in a much better position than last year, despite the weather not being very kind?
Yeah, so on the first point, yes, the government has been more proactive in releasing food grains, or rather in announcing that they will release food grains. I think they have been pretty consistent on that score. So I think that has definitely helped manage expectations. But as far as vegetables inflation is concerned, I think you should remember that last year we had a severe shock in the onion crop. So that was perhaps a one-off last year. And to the extent that we may not see a recurrence of that this year, I think definitely we are going to see much lower inflation.
Didn't we almost see a tomato shock?
Yeah, but that wasn't as widespread, or it didn't last long enough, right? I mean, an onion shock last year lasted long enough.
Okay.
And of course, again, I think this year already there are rumblings that potato and onion prices are going up again. So we have to wait and watch on that.
So you're saying basically you won't call victory on vegetable, or do you want to at least concede that despite a bad monsoon, we have somehow ensured that vegetable inflation doesn't become a generalized cereal and all food inflation?
Of course, I think that what I'm trying to say is the situation is definitely better than last year. So if you want to call that a victory, it is a victory, but it's not a man-made victory. I think we have just been lucky, that's all.
We've been lucky that it is not a terribly, not a terrible vegetable inflation.
That's right.
Okay. Well, Chetan, how much credit would you give the management? I mean, I want to know if any of you are giving credit to the government for ensuring that the vegetable inflation doesn't become a food inflation, because more from the government stocks, buffer stocks, have been offloaded. Is that the impression you're getting, Chetan?
Yeah, Latha, I think I would take a slightly bigger picture story on inflation, because it's not just food, but also core inflation is...
Chetan, I'm coming to core. I'm coming to core in a minute. I want to keep the overall, the global commodity and fuel inflation fall to the next question. I just want you to, ponder on whether the government has managed the vegetable inflation better and not allowed it to pour over to a general food inflation. I'll come to core in a minute.
Yeah, no, I think there are two key causes for food inflation to be high. One, as Dr. Sen mentioned, the MSP prices have been kept low. Second is the underappreciated point on rural wages. If we compute on a implied basis, rural wages inflation has probably gone down to around 11-12% YOY now. We have a data series break, so it's a bit of a guesstimate on the basis of the new series combined with the old one. And that's come down too. So the input cost for food production has also been systematically going down. We are not inflating demand for food by giving compensation to rural workers without getting any output against that. So I think that is also systematically helping bring down food inflation. So I would say both these factors are playing on it. And as the other gentleman mentioned, that we've been lucky that the weather problem really didn't get out of control. And so that's the third factor probably I would list as the one which is helping food inflation to be less painful than what we had seen last year.
Okay, Dr. Sen, one last word on this issue then. Would you agree with what Chetan and Prasanna are saying? One, that vegetable inflation in the first place was never so bad, so it's not really a man-made a government victory. And secondly, the other point, are rural wages genuinely lower? You are closer to statistics than anyone else. Do you think MSP plus rural wages are all, and offloading of food corporation stocks or buffer stocks have together actually controlled what could have been as bad a problem as last year?
Well, as far as rural wages are concerned, they've been trending down for a while now. So that trend is continuing. But, on the positive side, the rural wage inflation continues to ensure that the rural real wages are growing. So they're not actually shrinking, which is a good thing for the demand side. The real issue that we need to keep our eyes on is that, remember, as far as the consumer price index is concerned, the market prices of food grains accounts for about 75% of the total food grain weight.
Okay.
So it's the market price for food grains and not the PDS price that matters. And as far as the market price is concerned, the government has to reiterate its stand that it will intervene and make sure that cereal inflation does not go up. And I think that credibility does exist at the moment. But then,
have they been offloading more than they did last year?
They haven't offloaded very much. They've just made announcement that when necessary, they shall. At the moment, cereal inflation is not at an alarming level.
Okay. So just one final word from all of you then. Prasanna, you think food inflation can still get to, rise from 9% and towards 10% like it did last year, go from, 11 to 14% when it peaked in November? Is that, if not 14, is the trajectory still likely to be higher in food?
Oh, not necessarily. I think what we are going to see is the trajectory is actually going to be lower, right? I mean, vegetable prices seem to have peaked. So if that situation holds, and then November you have this base effect quite favorable, so actually food inflation could drop quite significantly from here.
Okay, and Chetan?
Yeah, we expect food inflation to continue to decelerate, Latha. So, in fact, I'm sort of boldly making the call that I think 12 months hence, you would realize that food inflation has got completely in control, because despite all the government officials denying, I think rural wages is the invisible hand which will control food inflation going forward as well.
Dr. Sen, your trajectory for food inflation, 6 months or 12 months down?
Well, as the base effect is important. So next 3 months, I would say certainly would trend down quite strongly. After that, it becomes a little bit more of a question mark, whether it will continue to trend down or it will kind of stabilize somewhere at around the 6.5 range.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, I have to take a break, but the conclusion I'm getting from my three experts is that actually the terrible part of the inflation, which is food inflation, itself may not be all that bad. In fact, Prasanna and Chetan are positive that it's going to trend distinctly lower. Dr. Sen perhaps is a little more cautious and only attributes it to base effect. But the majority comment appears to be that food inflation is certainly nowhere near how bad it was last year. We'll take a break and come back with the happier part of the inflation problem, which is the non-food inflation, the core inflation, in a minute.